Hello, everyone. Welcome to a little summer office hour. My name is Andrew. Some people know me as Professor Banks. I teach first year composition in California at a number of different institutions. Um, I wanted to do something kind of interesting today, which is I wanted to evaluate some AI generated content. I tried to think of what maybe one of my students would try to do if they were to use ChatGPT to write their 1,000 word to 1,500 word paper that perhaps I've assigned to them. So I gave ChatGPT a prompt to write a 1,000 word essay on the role of AI in the humanities. Pretty broad. Um, to be fair, I think I could have chosen a slightly more specific prompt because, as we're going to see, some of the things in this paper are also equally just as broad, and we all know that in about 1,000 words, we should be as specific as possible, but nonetheless. So I wanted to go ahead and evaluate this, partly because I was interested to see what would happen, right? And I must admit that after reading this particular piece from ChatGPT, I have seen students who have used a very similar looking format that ChatGPT tends to produce when you ask it to write an essay, and I'll comment on that when we get to that. And so I thought it would be interesting to evaluate it, maybe go through some of the things that I tend to do when I initially grade a paper. um, what am I thinking of? What are things that I'm looking for as a first year composition teacher? And the like. Perhaps this will be useful for some students, or perhaps this will be useful for some fellow teachers. I'm not sure, but we'll see what happens. So I will do the usual Zoom professor thing and share my screen, and we'll go directly to the Word document that I have. So all I've done is copy and paste the generated text from ChatGPT into a Word document, and I happened to center the title um, of this particular paper, which, as you'll see, as the first thing that we get to see in this paper, as any reader would, this is a fairly banal looking title. And that's my first thing that I kind of want to talk about with how a chat GPT performs when writing papers, is that in general, the content that it produces isn't wrong. It's not misinformed all the time, although sometimes it is a bit misinformed, and it even says as much when you use it. So that's something to consider. But first and foremost, it is boring. It is unimaginative, and I'm sure you can imagine why it is unimaginative, because it is still just a large language model. It is not entirely creative. It's generative, but it's not necessarily creative or interesting per se. It does do some interesting things later on in this paper that I will give it credit for. But when it comes to connecting different ideas and creating something that is interesting to read, it doesn't perform very well. And you can see it right here at the beginning with this title, The Role of AI in the Humanities. That is exactly what I asked it to write about. It took it directly from the prompt, and as such, it used it for its title, and it is quite boring. This is also reflective of maybe a decision that any other student might make as well. Believe it or not, I've seen plenty of students who they go in to write their paper, and their choice in title is boring. It's either dull and descriptive and taken exactly from the prompt, just as ChatGPT did here, or it's something that just is a restatement of whatever the assignment is, essay one, or analysis paper or something like that. Nothing that's really creative and that tells me anything about the focus and intrigue of the coming piece. I do have some students who really listen to my words when I say write a creative title, right? Some people take that to heart and they really get good at writing creative titles, but ChatGPT can't seem to write a creative title in this case. So let's read the introduction. And generally, when I start grading a paper, I don't jump directly into it. I will admit, like I'm kind of doing here. I will give it kind of a skim once over to check things like formatting, whether or not there's a works cited page, which, spoiler alert, there isn't a works cited page for this, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Um, but I will give it a once over just to kind of see the general features of the paper, whether or not it met the page count, or maybe you met the word count, depending on whether I can analyze that on the fly like that. But I will kind of give it a once over, scroll through, see what's going on, and then I'll read the paper. But in this case, I'm just going to go straight in. So, title, boring. That's the first thing that we need to notice here. The title is banal, and that's going to be a theme. Banality is going to be a theme as we go through this, um, through this particular paper, and that's a doc automatically, um, for reasons that are really actually quite important. Um, I fear students writing or using ChatGPT to write their papers for them, rather. I fear students sourcing that out to ChatGPT because I'm not interested in whether or not a student can parrot back information to me, especially not in first year composition. I really couldn't care less whether or not you understood the exact facts that we were talking about, or whether or not you got every single fact right in your research. What I'm far more interested in, and I would hope other professors are also interested in this, is whether or not you've connected the ideas, those facts that you had to research, those ideas that you had, whether or not you've connected them and packaged them in a certain sense in a way that is interesting, engaging, and insightful. I think some students tend to underestimate the degree to which their connections and ideas are actually interesting, and they can be. Sometimes people haven't learned enough to make um, interesting connections, and that's okay. It's a skill that can be learned through literacy and reading, generally acquiring knowledge. But what I am looking for, and what I hope again other professors are looking for, is again whether or not they're making interesting connections, not just whether or not they can perform the basic task, right? And again, ChatGPT, as we're going to see here, because it is so banal, can't seem to really make interesting connections between facts. And that's another part of creativity that it simply hasn't gotten to yet. Maybe it will. Maybe it can be taught creativity. Um, Maybe it can learn to do creativity. I don't know. I don't know what the limitations are, but I will say that I'm not impressed necessarily. I'm not sensing insight from this paper, and we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to go and read the introduction, and then I'll explain maybe some of the things that I'm looking for in an introduction in my classes, and we'll see how whether or not it measures up to that standard. So, artificial intelligence, AI, has become a transformative force across various disciplines, including the humanities. Traditionally, the humanities focus on the study of human culture, encompassing areas such as literature, history, philosophy, and the arts. The integration, of AI into these fields is reshaping how scholars approach, analyze, and interpret human cultural artifacts. This paper explores the multifaceted role AI plays in the humanities, highlighting its contributions to research methodologies, data analysis, and the broader understanding of human culture. Now, the first thing that I'm going to say about this introduction is that it's lacking a clear thesis statement, or at least what I'm expecting to be a clear thesis statement. And linked to that, the entire introduction is actually a bit too broad in order to generate any kind of insight. It is written in a nicely informative manner, and this does tell me a little bit about what I think, if this kind of consideration exists at all, what I think the intended audience is, or who I think the intended audience is here. But I do think it's a little bit inappropriate for what I would generally teach my students. So let's think about these statements and think about who are these statements for exactly? What kind of person would you say these particular sentences to? Um, Starting with the hook or the first sentence here, what I call the focus statement or the focus section of the introduction, where we establish contact with our audience, right? It's the first thing that the audience sees besides the title. So it's very important how we establish that contact. And the first thing that ChatGPT decided to say to it was artificial intelligence has become a transformative force across various disciplines, including the humanities. So here's what's good about this. I know what the topic is, and I even know the trajectory a little bit. Like, where is this going to go, possibly? I know that the topic is about AI. And I know that the topic is also about the humanities and what's the relationship there. And it starts expressing what that relationship is by saying that it is a transformative force. The problem comes in when I start questioning a little bit, what do we mean by transformative force? Could we have chose something slightly more specific? But we don't need to quite do that just yet, because I will bank as a reader on the fact that you're going to explain this as you go through your introduction. So I can leave that be. It's not a terrible hook. It's not even a wrong hook. Okay. Um, but as we go forward, we might find that we need to make some adjustments. So the hook is okay for the moment. I can buy into it. This isn't such a bad way to establish contact with the reader. I might question the idea, maybe, who doesn't already know this, right? Um, how is this not already obvious to a variety of people who know anything about my topic, or its topic rather, generative AI, or artificial intelligence in general, and the humanities? Okay. Who doesn't already recognize that AI is a transformative force in the humanities, right? Or at least in the sciences, or in any academic field, or in any field at all, right? Who doesn't already recognize that that's the case? Is this maybe too obvious of a statement that we need to be making? And again, that depends on who our readers are. And I think we're going to get a little bit more information as far as who ChatGPT is trying to talk to here as we move forward. If ChatGPT is trying to talk to anybody at all, if it has any consideration of audience, which I am not sure. So, second line, traditionally, the humanities focus on the study of human culture, encompassing areas such as literature, history, philosophy, and the arts. So, this is where I start sensing something is a little bit fishy, because I'm again asking, who is this statement for, right? What kind of person with what amount of knowledge would I say this to? Well, I would only give a definition of the humanities in this generalized way if I'm talking to somebody who maybe doesn't know what the humanities are, which tells me that I'm not talking to an audience that already knows, or maybe is already involved in the humanities, maybe such as someone like myself, for instance, right? I'm not talking to somebody maybe who is an academic per se. I'm talking to somebody who is maybe a much more generalized audience, a much more amorphous audience in this case, which isn't always a good thing. And that leads to a number of um, troubling decisions that end up getting made, especially when real human beings are writing. Not knowing who exactly you're trying to talk to, who exactly you're trying to reach in your given papers, is really a detriment. Okay. If you don't know who you're talking to, you don't know how to talk to them, which means you don't know what kinds of statements to make about your topic, right? I can only assume that with such a generalized statement, such as this second sentence, that ChatGPT is talking to a general audience, an audience that may not know a variety of different things about these topics already. And I'm just not entirely sure that's specific enough to create a good piece. That also means that ChatGPT is going to adopt a largely informative tone throughout this particular paper. Now, this can be good or bad depending on, again, what is the prompt trying to say? Granted, my prompt wasn't very specific. I neglected to incorporate specific verbiage saying, like, what are you supposed to do with this topic? I just said, write a paper. And so it chose to do something in the informative style for a general audience. Um, I imagine if I made it maybe slightly more specific, that it would maybe perform a little bit better. But if I have all these expectations as a professor and I give a prompt and I've explained to my students that I want a specific audience that you've thought of, right? I want um you to talk to those people and to really evaluate who it is you're talking to and create statements that are specific to those kinds of people and their knowledge and their lack of knowledge, right? And then they go to ChatGPT and they put these words in and they put the prompt in and they say, even just for themselves, write 1,000 word paper on this subject. It'll do this. It will seem to default to the informative mode. And it's too general. It's too general for somebody like me or anybody else, I imagine, and I hope, teaching at all, whether it's public school or higher education or whatever. Um, we're hoping for insight. We're hoping for something unique and interesting and individualized at very least. Something that is very specific and geared towards a specific audience as best as it can be. And here, it simply isn't the case. This kind of statement is meant for somebody who doesn't know what the humanities are, and therefore we're talking to a general audience. Moving on, the integration of AI into these fields is reshaping how scholars approach, analyze, interpret human cultural artifacts. So, we have 1,000 words to work with, right? It sounds like that's a lot of ground to cover in 1,000 words. And I'm already questioning, okay, if this was a real person, right? How are you going to manage to write a very specific, focused paper on all of these different things? And we're going to see this also in this next statement. This essay explores, which I have something to say about, the multifaceted role AI plays in the humanities, highlighting its contributions to research methodologies, data analysis, and the broader understanding of human culture. So the first two, I think, are actually somewhat specific: research methodologies and data analysis. Whatever those may mean, that's okay. I mean, I think they're all right, but the broader understanding of human culture, I'm a little skeptical of, because again, it's so broad. It says it right there. It is so broad. It's difficult for me to believe that any student is going to write a specific enough paper for 1,000 words, a specific enough paper with that in mind. So ChatGPT here kind of has a focusing issue here, right? That may again be because it has chosen to adopt a more informative genre as well as a more general audience, right? And is presupposing a lack of knowledge rather than any kind of supply of knowledge for a particular audience. Um, so that's a little bit troubling. The scope is just way too broad, and it's too much to write in 1,000 words, especially for what I would be expecting. 1,000 words isn't even enough to cover one of those things, right? Research methodologies, data analysis, or the broader understanding of human culture. It's not even enough. Like, we're really getting very broad, and I generally will write broad prompts. Even if I do have something specific in mind, I will try to keep it broad enough to allow for individuality in my students' papers. ChatGPT doesn't seem to factor that in. It doesn't seem to understand that there can be some individuality here. Instead, it tries to exist within the parameters of the prompt, which I imagine that as a result of how it is trained, right? Because I do know that humans train AI to answer certain kinds of prompts in specific ways. So I imagine that has something to do with it. But nonetheless, and again, in line with being too broad, there is no real thesis statement here. There is a purpose statement, right? A kind of statement of intent. This essay explores the multifaceted role AI plays, etc., right? Which in my model that I teach to my students, that is a purpose statement. And it's placed correctly in the introduction. As a matter of fact, besides the lack of thesis statement, this introduction does follow the form that I teach. It has a focusing statement, which begins the paragraph. It's usually the hook. It establishes what the topic is. It establishes what the focus is for the essay, what's going to be what you're going to talk about, right? It has some setup information that includes a definition, which definitions tend to be anyway, setup information. What kind of background information does the reader need in order to understand your argument? And then it has a purpose statement with this essay explores the multifaceted role, etc. But then it doesn't really have a thesis statement. It doesn't have an arguable sentence that ends the paragraph and actually gives some sense of meaning and point and structure to the whole thing. right? And thesis statements are really important. If I have any students who are listening, you should know that having a really good thesis statement is not just so that your reader or your professor can read through your paper as efficiently as possible. It is actually a necessary component of writing. Okay. In order to lead your reader through your paper, you need to have a clear thesis statement that you've given to them. And the thesis statement kind of acts like a roadmap, a key to the way that the rest of the paper is supposed to make sense, right? It's not just that you say what you're going to say, boom, there it is, and then everything is sort of superfluous. It's that the reader will read your thesis statement and they're going to hold on to that. And they're going to know where to look if they've forgotten what your point was, right? They're going to hold on to that and they're going to read the rest of your paper and understand how everything else falls in line with that initial statement, right? It actually structures the rest of the paper for them as a result of giving it to them at the beginning in this way. And that's a really important dimension. If you don't already know, that's a really important dimension to any paper. ChatGPT, in this case, does not give one. It does give some kind of structuring statement in the form of the purpose statement. It does kind of outline what the paper is going to do. It gives an outline of each of its sections. So that is helpful, but it has no clear argument. And again, that may be because it's adopted an informative tone, an informative kind of style, right? Um, it's working in an informative genre, if you want to put it that way, and it's working towards, or it's writing to rather, a generalized audience, right? An audience that it doesn't really have a grasp on, doesn't know the level of knowledge, right? Or it simply hasn't thought of one and it just defaults to writing to a generalized audience no matter what, which would make sense given its primary usage as a research tool. People Googling, basically doing a Google search through it, doing some kind of keyword search through it, asking a direct question, that sort of thing. So that's understandable. But also, if you're a student who's tempted to use ChatGPT, understand that's what it's going to give you. And it's not necessarily going to fly in the face of somebody like me who's looking for an individualized response, right? Something that is unique to your own understanding, right? And this is something else that I emphasize with my students too. It doesn't matter to me personally, right? If you decide to go ahead and use ChatGPT. I mean, I disagree with it, not because like, oh, well, I don't want to read, AI generated content, but because the student, you, are doing yourself a disservice, right? When you write, you are creating structure in your own understanding of a given topic, and you may not care about whatever it is that you're supposed to be studying. And I understand that we all have those classes, which is already a problem, by the way. I mean, you're supposed to be going to school to broaden your mind, to train your mind in a variety of ways that are supposed to be excellent for you, for your development as a human being. So you should probably care about what it is that you're writing about, and you should care enough about yourself and about your own mind to actually write something. Otherwise, I'm sorry, you may not be in school for the right reason, right? But that's a whole other topic that I won't get into. Again, I tell my students though that it doesn't really, hurt me per se if you happen to use ChatGPT. It hurts you. You're wasting your own time and you're not actually getting anything from me as your professor if I'm just sitting there reading something that you didn't really write. You're just looking to pass the class. And I'm I'm not motivated to work with someone who just does that. And so, again, I'm going to give it my all. I'm going to give them feedback because sometimes, hey, you could fly under my radar. I'm human, I'm fallible, right? Maybe I don't realize that it's something that was written by an AI or that you use some material written by a generative AI. But you're not doing yourself any favors personally. You're not going to actually learn anything in my class if you do that. That should be obvious. And that's what I tell to all my students. Um, so, anyway, this is essentially how the rest of this paper is going to go. However, there are some interesting facets of this paper in its body paragraphs that I think are worthwhile paying attention to. And that's what the next video is going to talk about. So thank you so much for listening during this little summer office hour, and I will see you in the next video.